So we are now officially launching this event. Excellencies, dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who is with us on WebEx, to who is now on Facebook, and to who is watching the video on YouTube. We have the pleasure to welcome you today for a side event to the 48th session of the Human Rights Council, convened by the Special Rapporteur on the implications for human rights of the environmentally sound management of disposal of hazardous substances and wastes, or more simply, the Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, Marcos Orellana. This side event on the right to science in the context of toxic substances is co-sponsored by Uruguay and Switzerland, and is organized within the framework of the Geneva Toxic Free Talks with logistical support of the Geneva Environment Network. After the opening remarks, we will be guided throughout this event by Yves LADOR, the representative of Earthjustice to the United Nations in Geneva. It is now our pleasure to turn to the permanent representative of Uruguay, co-sponsoring this event, for opening remarks. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to share with the distinguished personalities this panel. And I would like to express my gratitude to the Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, Marcos Orellana, for timely convening this meeting or this size event. I would like to quote the UN Secretary General's words at the opening of the present General Assembly. I quote, "We see the warning signs in every continent and region, scorching temperatures, choking biodiversity, loss, polluted air, water, and natural spaces. In summary, we face three planetary crises: climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. Interconnections characterize our time and is reflected in the crisis we face in the present century. These phenomena have multiple ramifications. They require coordinated actions from the states and multiple stakeholders covering different areas as UN bodies, civil society, scientists, academy, and the private sector. We need to continue working together to address this crisis that know no borders and, due to their dimensions, require agile and efficient responses. In this sense, for better decision-making at the national, regional, and international levels, an independent and intergovernmental science policy panel on chemicals and waste should be established. For what purpose? To harmonize scientists and evaluate existing scientific knowledge, to facilitate the determination of risk and harmful effects on human health and the environment, with a special focus on human rights. International cooperation is of critical importance for developing countries and for the benefit of the international community. The science policy panels make a valuable contribution to international negotiations and to the progressive development of international environmental law, which Uruguay promotes since 1981 with the Montevideo Program for Development and Periodic Review of Environmental Law. Also, we will be able to strengthen the new framework of, say, CACM beyond 2020, the plastic waste management, as well as the global governance of chemicals and waste. Also, we will be able to accelerate actions to tackle the three current environment crises at the same time as climate change, protecting biodiversity, and preventing and reducing global pollution. We hope to deepen the discussion on the creation of the SPI in the next segment of the UNF 5. We welcome the report of the Special Rapporteur on the right to science in the context of toxic substance that was presented yesterday to the 48th session of the Human Rights Council. And especially, we would like to highlight the interrelation between the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications, referred to as the right to science, and the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment to face the severe toxification on the planet and its people. He presented to us a clear picture that the unsound management of chemicals and waste create dangerous sources of pollution for our societies and environment. In fact, most of the global population is exposed to hazardous substances and wastes without their consent, which adversely affect a range of human rights, including the right to life, health, adequate food and housing, clean air and safe water, a healthy environment, and safe and healthy work. In that sense, several international law instruments as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights recognize the right of everyone to share in scientific advances and his benefits. Also, the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights expand upon this right on the obligation of states. The right to science is also reflected in regional human rights instruments and several national constitutions. For instance, as recognized by the Special Rapporteur report in the Americas, the Inter-American system provides a comprehensive protection of the right to science. The American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man recognized the right to science in language similar to that of the Universal Declaration. Also, the Charter of Organization of American States called for the sharing of the benefits of science and technology among its member states. Lately, the Protocol of San Salvador, signed in 1988, further elaborate upon the right to science. Uruguay legislation recognized the state's obligation to prevent the exposure of people to hazardous chemicals and waste and protect them for the risk and harmful effects. Yesterday, the UN Secretary General stressed that science is under assault. In that sense, we need to take positive actions against this disinformation, which directly violate the right to science through global cooperation and solidarity by dissemination scientific knowledge in a transparent manner and communication it in plain language, allowing the public to receive the best available scientific evidence, which improve the realization of this right. Likewise, we would like to highlight the importance to protect scientists that are often subject to intimidation, harassment, threats, and persecution, and to promote the exercise of academic and scientific freedoms, as well as the right to freedom of expression, which are indispensable for scientific research. The Special Rapporteur in the introductory paragraph of his report expresses, science provides the international community with knowledge through the risk about the risk and harms posed by a hazardous substance on human health and the environment, and thus enable to elaborate the elaboration of evidence-based policies to address those threats. Science-based political protect the range of human rights that are compromised when individuals and community are exposed to hazardous substances and waste. As an example of the positive link between science and policy, allow me to describe our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Uruguayan government has taken decisive action based on science and on recommendation of the WHO. Transparent and constant communication, ensuring the population the right to information, public participation, and responsible freedom of the population have characterized our management of the crisis. In this case, all decisions taken were based on the permanent advice of 58 multidisciplinary science experts, members of the core Honorary Scientific Advisor Group, GACH, which was created during the health emergency. Several disciplines debated, cooperated, and conducted an interdisciplinary dialogue on broad scope. This avoided doubts from the public opinion and allowed to organize successful vaccine campaigns. Thank you very much for your attention, and we will give the floor to the next panel member. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Excellency. And indeed, I have now the pleasure to turn to Felix WERTLI, Head of the Global Affairs Section at the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment, for his opening remarks. Switzerland is also co-sponsoring this event. Felix, over to you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today, and also thank you very much for the report we have received. And I think I would also like to support very much what His Excellency from Uruguay has mentioned before. And I even have the chance to focus on one of the points that you have raised and mentioned. I will focus my intervention on the Intergovernmental Science Policy Panel. You might have heard at the Berlin Conference on Chemicals, Switzerland made a proposal to launch at next UNEA a decision to establish such a governmental science policy panel and to launch negotiations for it. Perhaps a few thoughts about where we are coming from, what we're expecting, and also linkages to the report we have received from the Special Rapporteur. And I think when you look at the report we have received, it's really a lot is already mentioned, para 1 and 2, no? There it's highlighted the very importance of communication, effective channels connecting science with policy making. And that is exactly what we are aiming to enhance and to improve. At the moment, the chemics and waste cluster has no international institution such as the climate with IPCC or biodiversity IPES. We have instruments like the Global Chemics Outlook. However, those are not sufficient. They don't have the standing and the format, besides many very important valuable informations in it, to reach the large audience and to reach the policymakers and provide the necessary information. I think one point we have also seen in the report is that there has been mentioned a lot of this fragmentation in the chemicals and waste cluster regarding science policy. And I have to admit, I'm not fully sure if fragmentation is the right term to describe it. Because we have currently very important science policy bodies, for example, under the MEAs like POPROC for the Stockholm or the TEEP in Montreal Protocol. And they have a specific task. So they have a task to fulfill that is well defined and very important. So we think they work in itself. They have the standing, they do what they have to do. For sure, there's always room for improvement. There's room for adaptation to take up if there's specific challenges. There's one mention of the CRC in Rotterdam. I think we are also looking into it, what we can do better there. But in principle, they have a clear function. What we talk about is something else. Something like a science policy panel for the entire chemicals and waste cluster. And Switzerland and most probably a few other countries are going to submit together at UNEA 5.2 a resolution to suggesting the establishment of such a panel and to launch negotiations. Perhaps a few thoughts about some keywords or the concept behind. So when we talk about science policy panel, we emphasize the importance it has to be intergovernmental. And here again, we're getting back to what I said in the beginning, also the beginning of the report. We need an effective channel connecting academia with policy making. And to have the best channel it is when the policy can ask questions to academia and academia can respond. So it's a two-way stream. Because we know in chemicals and waste, we have a lot of science, we have a lot of informations. but we have to have this information in a way that policymakers can act on it. And this is the best way, in our view, to achieve this, that we can see, for example, in climate change, if the policy side can ask questions and get responses. Responses that are consensus-based, state-of-the-art advice, that is policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. So it has to be advice that we can use for policy making, but for sure it can't say how we have to do it. It gives option, and then governments have to decide on it. I think also one part of the report addresses the question, what is science in fact? And when we talk about science in this context of a governmental science policy panel, then we have kind of a wide meaning. It includes all relevant disciplines like chemistry, physics, toxicology and ecotoxicology, material science, sustainability, agronomy, or economics, for example. So it's depending on the issue, what the policy side is asking, then we have to get the right scientists, the right academia on board to provide those answers. I think also a very important element is the conflict of interest policies. And as also mentioned in the report, there we have examples, we have good examples, we can build up on experiences, for example, of IPCC to work for those issues. Perhaps a few key elements of such a science policy panel. And I think we see three key functions. The first one would be this horizon scanning. So the examination of information to identify potential threats, risks, emerging issues, and opportunities. It could also be a tool to identify issues of concern and provide evidence-based options how to address them. A second function would be undertake assessments on the nature and scale of particular issues. So this assessment of assessments will be basic science. It gathers information around, gets them together, and then to answer the questions made by the policy side. And the third would be communication, so to provide up-to-date relevant information, catalyze scientific research, have this communication between scientists and policymakers, and also to larger public. So also the chance to emphasize, to better communicate on the huge challenges. And as the Ambassador of Uruguay has mentioned, we have those environmental crises. We have the climate with IPCC. We have biodiversity, where we have IPES. And now we need one for the chemical waste cluster to respond to this one. For sure, we could not make a copy-paste from existing, like you can't make a copy-paste from IPCC. We have to find a specific form that is adjusted, adapted to the needs and the functions of the chemical waste cluster. So we have taken into account what we have already, like for example, the conventions. We have to address and to find, to access the knowledge that exists. I think in particular, the IUMC, so there's UN organizations that work on chemical safety, the sound management of chemical waste. We have to include them. I think also it should not only be environment, it has to be environment and health. So we have to very strongly include UNEP and WHO. And to fulfill the list also, we have to find a way to work with our stakeholders, non-governmental, private sector and so on, to harness from their experience, from their knowledge, to have really fulfilled the sound informations. Yes, a few thoughts on that, and I think with that I will leave it for the moment. So thanks again for the opportunity to be able to be part of this panel today, and thank you very much for the report. As mentioned, it was quite a good food for thought. You have highlighted some important challenges. You have also raised the opportunities. And as I try to explain now, it's like what we see as a key opportunity is to establish such a panel, to take up important questions, to deliver sound informations and policy relevant options to improve the sound management of chemicals and waste. Thank you.
And now with that, we have closed the opening remarks, and I'm giving the floor to Yves LADOR, the former representative of Earthjustice, who will be with you for the next part of this event.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you for having me in this event. And we have just heard with the excellent and very substantial introductory remarks how this report is really coming at the right time. So we will start, and I will really first turn to Professor Orellana, the Special Rapporteur, before turning afterwards to the different contributions and comments on his report that will follow, and I will present each of the person one at a time. So let me first start with Professor Orellana. As we just heard, you presented yesterday your report to the Human Rights Council, and indeed it comes at a very good time, and because of the context, as it was just presented, there are a number of discussions on the issue of scientific bodies in the field of chemicals and toxics. But there's also, you are also bringing some very substantial elements on what is the right to science and how can it be fulfilled, how can it be ensured for the people to have a possibility to understand the environment in which they are living. Because especially in the field of toxics, we need science to know exactly what we're eating, what we're breathing, and in which environment we are. So Professor Orellana, would you please tell us a bit what is your report and what has motivated you to bring this issue to the Human Rights Council? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yves, and thank you also to Uruguay and Switzerland for co-sponsoring this event, as well as Earthjustice Center for International Environmental Law and the Geneva Environment Network. I am very pleased to be with you today and to speak about the report that I presented yesterday to the Council on the right to science and its implications for the sound management of hazardous substances. By way of introduction, I could start saying, as I mentioned yesterday, that the right to science has largely, until recently, been ignored by the human rights community, and it's high time for it to be given the role and implementation that it deserves. In that regard, General Comment 25 of the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights that was produced last year in 2020 provides already a solid basis to explore the implications of the right to science in the toxics context. And these implications must take cognizance at the outset of at least two elements of reality that I wish to highlight. The first one, as already mentioned by His Excellency Ambassador of Uruguay, in quoting Secretary General, also the High Commissioner in her opening statement to the Council a few days ago, talked about the triple crisis of pollution, climate change, and loss of nature that is affecting humanity. In the face of this crisis, we need all the tools that we can muster in order to confront it and overcome it. That's the first very big point. And the second one is attacks against science, either for profit or ideology. We have seen over the last years and decades a concerted attack against science and scientists, whether it's disinformation for profit or ideology, whether it's attacks against scientists for other reasons. The outcome of that is confusion, and that is to the benefit of those who want to continue to profit from the status quo. The report puts an emphasis on the science policy interface, and this is also guided by the most recent Human Rights Council resolution that renewed the mandate, which puts an emphasis on this element. So with that, by way of introduction, some of the key components in the anatomy of the report. The report describes science. It describes what is scientific evidence. It then provides an overview of how the right to science is recognized in global and regional human rights instruments. It identifies threats against science and scientists. It also identifies mechanisms for science to inform toxics. I will speak to these elements in a moment, but I also wish to highlight what the report does not cover. This is not the first report of the Special Rapporteur on the right to science. There have been previous reports that focused on intellectual property rights, for example, so I do not get into that. I do also not get into the question of how science or its applications can themselves violate human rights. So in terms of what is science, only a couple key points to share this time. To highlight that science is a body of specialized and specific knowledge, of knowledge accumulated through an iterative, logical, and empirically based process. And I emphasize this because this body of knowledge can be distinguished from other forms of knowledge, such as the knowledge, experiential knowledge of local communities that may be affected by chemicals and waste, or traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples. Now, this distinction has a couple implications. One is on the participation in the process of science. So there, the report speaks, for example, to so-called citizen science and the importance of protocols and the information derived from that experience. This is an element also that ties with agency, in that communities get this information and with it are able to take their destiny in their own hands and advocate, be the best advocates for their interests. So that's one element. And then there's participation in decision making. So the scientific process on the one hand, but then the decisions that flow from that. And this is where the right to science connects quite directly with the right to participate in decision making, right to information as well. That's one element that I wish to highlight on science as a specific form of knowledge. A second element is that science involves an enabling environment for scientific evidence to flourish. So what are some of the elements that go into this enabling environment? The freedoms to determine topics of research, whether it's basic science or applied science. Perhaps a counterpart to that freedom is the government's duty to also make sure that there are resources available for research on issues of particular social need. So not only the interests of some segments of the population, especially wealthy components that can afford certain technologies, but also what does the right to science mean for the prevention of exposure to hazardous substances? This is a key point that I wish to highlight. Another freedom that is central to an enabling environment is the freedom to act from, without pressure, the freedom from undue pressure. And this links also freedom of expression and information, which is so often curtailed. And I'll come back to this when talking about threats to science and to scientists. These are, in a way, telegraphic, a couple of points that give you a flavor of what the report covers. A second big component in the anatomy of the report is the analysis of international instruments. It goes into looking at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the way that the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights has interpreted the totality of Article 15, so not just the element that focuses on the right to benefit from scientific progress and applications. But a point that I wish to highlight, building on what His Excellency Ambassador from Uruguay pointed out in the Inter-American system, is that even those regional systems that do not explicitly recognize a standalone right to science have nevertheless, in their jurisprudence, hearing cases, elaborated on the significance of scientific evidence. And that's, for example, in the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights in relation to Article 6 on fair trial, latency periods, and the denial of justice in exposure of toxics, Articles 2 and 8, private life, right to life, in relation to environmental risks. Jurisprudence takes account and builds on issues of environmental risks and environmental evidence. And similarly with the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, where the right to a healthy and safe environment has been interpreted in relation to scientific evidence and the participation of communities in decision making. So that's again a bit telegraphic, but for the sake of time, I'll quickly move to share some thoughts of on normative content. What does the right to science actually require? How can science be used and should it be used to inform policy? Starting point here is to recognize that one of the key benefits of science is the generation of scientific knowledge. But that scientific knowledge will not benefit society unless it is translated into actual measures that provide protection to the population in relation to the risks and harms that scientific evidence reveals or uncovers or determines. And so that's where the science policy interface becomes so important. Now, in order to operationalize that, unpacking several duties is, first of all, the availability and accessibility of scientific information. This includes the underlying data on legislative proposals, for example. In this relation, the availability of scientific evidence enables the taking of measures on that basis, and that can be regarded as a second duty. The duty to take measures, a positive duty, the duty to align the existing regulations with best available scientific evidence. This brings in a dynamic concept of, for example, environmental and health regulations as science progresses. So it is expected that regulations will also progress. One point I wish to highlight here, it also came up in the interactive dialogue yesterday, is that best available scientific evidence is not a monolithic body of knowledge. At times, scientific evidence close to a core of consensus may show precisely that level of consensus of what is a fact. But moving out of that core, there may be divergent or minority views. Now, so long as the knowledge is derived from scientific method, that it follows peer review, that there's ample opportunity for expression, opinion, for testing, interrogating, that there's transparency, etc. So the components of what makes an enabling environment for the scientific undertaking, those divergent minority opinions can very well form the basis of policy, and the World Trade Organization, for example, in its jurisprudence has recognized at least that much. Another point that's worth highlighting here is on the precautionary principle. This was also a question yesterday in the interactive dialogue, because it is at times argued that the precautionary principle is anti-science. It would justify measures without scientific evidence, and that's a complete distortion of what the precautionary principle's function and role is about. The precautionary principle begins to fill gaps. It complements scientific process. Scientific process is by its own nature inherently an constant process of interrogation and review. The knowledge is incremental. There may well be gaps, and there are unavoidable uncertainties. And so in order to take measures and frame policies in those situations and circumstances, the precautionary principle plays that role. It has been understood as an element of due diligence by recent decisions of international courts that have looked at this. For example, the Inter-American Court's advisory opinion on human rights and the environment a couple of years ago. Similarly, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. And it has been critically important for decisions at the national level. I think I'm running out of time, so I will very quickly pass to another key element of normative content, which is international cooperation. And international cooperation is critical, as the COVID pandemic has shown. Solidarity is one of the few key elements, one of the critical elements that are needed in order to overcome this global threat. Now, it can take place bilaterally. Developing countries often lack the resources and capacity to conduct original scientific research, and very well can benefit from the information that is derived in other parts of the world, so that bilateral cooperation, information clearing houses, etc., but also globally or internationally. And that's where science policy interface platforms play a very important role. The report scans the landscape of existing platforms, particularly on multilateral environmental agreements, and concludes that they're fragmented. I take the point just made by Felix WERTLI from Switzerland that fragmented may not be the most felicitous expression. What's intended here is that the scope of MEAs is focused, is limited, and so the science policy interface serving that MEA is necessarily so also limited, and so we have kind of an archipelago of platforms. In that sense, they're fragmented. In some other senses, they're limited in that at times the evidence so derived and assessed in those platforms has not translated into actual measures of protection. The example of the Rotterdam Convention in regards to asbestos or paraquat is ostensible, and steps to overcome that paralysis is very important. So to echo again, Felix WERTLI, the need for a global platform, as he said, horizon scanning, holistic. It's not just on the terms of reference of one MEA, but on the whole field. What's coming up in the horizon? Authoritative assessments. And he also spoke about communication. Perhaps I would frame it, there's a nuance there with awareness. Awareness in the public, there's an element of education. So very quickly then, passing to talk about a few of the threats that the report identifies against science and against scientists, the tactics to divert and delay. Some of the playbook here, often deployed by industry, was developed in the 1950s, originally by the tobacco industry, and has since been applied in a range of areas, climate change, chemicals, etc., to highlight alternative explanations and divert attention. It may be this or that or the other, or to claim lack of proof and demand ever increasing scientific evidence, so paralysis by analysis, or funding front groups that appear legitimate, appear as devoted to the public interest, but are really there to confuse and sow uncertainty. Disinformation in this way is a direct attack against the right to science. Another point worth highlighting here is conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest, inappropriate financial relations between those scientists, other persons involved in the science policy platforms, they can undermine the whole effort at translating science into policy. There is a big debate as to whether conflicts of interest should be managed or should be avoided altogether. Managed as in disclosures of affiliations, or avoided as in clear terms of reference for who can sit in or who is not welcome to sit in these platforms. The report takes a very clear position that conflicts of interest should be avoided in order to preserve the credibility of the scientific enterprise. There's more that could be said about greenwashing, so the appearance of efforts while nothing changes, or woke washing, so blame the poor for not taking measures that could affect the poor. This is big in climate change as well. But those are a few of the threats that are directed against science, and particularly offensive are the threats against scientists, campaigns of harassment, intimidation against them and their families. This is all very worrying, and one point that the report makes is that scientists who sound the alarm on risks and harms associated with hazardous substances should be regarded and protected as human rights defenders and benefit from international and national instruments for their protection, including whistleblower protection. So to conclude very quickly, the right to science is a key tool for humanity to confront the triple crisis of pollution, climate change, and biodiversity. For this, it requires that measures be aligned with the best available science. And in order to achieve that, science policy interface platforms that are free of conflict of interest are critical to transform knowledge into policy. Thank you very much for your attention, and I very much look forward to any comments and questions that you may have. Back to you, Yves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Orellana. That was very substantial and an excellent presentation of your report to the Human Rights Council, and I think you've shown very clearly how the right to science, which helps to have the best technology available and also can contribute to prevent harm, is something that can guide the move we are really witnessing right now, where we see going from the expertise to this science and policy interface. So there is a wide impact of what has been done with the IPCC, which is now also going to other fields of science. We have already with IPBS, but here something new is opening up, and we look forward for and we hope also that the decision that will come at UNEA in the beginning of next year will also take into consideration what you have just provided to the Human Rights Council, because it is a very excellent instrument. And you have right now just finished on some of the threats. Unfortunately, that's scientists, but also science as a process is very often facing. And I'd like to turn now to Professor VANDENBERG. Professor VANDENBERG, you are Dean and also Professor at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And your work is very well known on the question and the difficulties that science has had to face with distortions, campaigns, and so on. So the integrity of the scientific process in the field of toxics has been actually challenged more than once. So we're really very happy to have you with us, and I give you the floor now.
Thank you. I'm sorry, my camera is not working on WebEx, and hopefully looking at my picture is not the worst thing that you'll have to see today, but I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to contribute some comments on the issues related to why providing people with information, scientific knowledge is a human right. And my work has really focused on two aspects of this question. One is as a laboratory scientist, a research scientist, I and the folks that work in my lab have worked hard to evaluate the effects of numerous chemicals on health effects using laboratory animals. And my work has contributed a lot of knowledge specifically on a class of chemicals that are known as endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs. There has been a lot of work that's been done at the UN, at the WHO, and with other international organizations that are focused on identifying why EDCs pose such a hazard to the public. And of course, as I'm sure those of you who are listening are aware, these are chemicals that pose threats because they're hazardous to individuals and to communities. They're hazardous to workers who are exposed during the production of the chemicals themselves or products. But they're also hazardous because many of these chemicals persist in the environment and continue to affect populations long after their use was ever intended. And they affect more than just human populations, but also wildlife populations. But more recently, my work has also started to focus on understanding why the best evidence is not actually used by regulatory agencies or governments to protect public health. And one of the reasons why is that there's a large concerted effort by polluting industries and manufacturing industries to continue to promote the use of chemicals, even after those industries themselves have knowledge of the harm that those chemicals can pose. this is not news to anyone who's been around for the last 50 years and saw many tactics that were used by the tobacco industry to try to promote the health of tobacco in some cases, or to refute really solid scientific knowledge that's not refutable about the effects of tobacco on human health. And yet the tobacco industry provided us with what they referred to themselves as a playbook, where in industry documents that were released after lawsuits against the tobacco industry, that the tobacco industry acknowledged that their goal was not to sell tobacco alone, but also to convince the public that there was insufficient evidence of harm associated with tobacco. And so work that myself and my colleagues have been doing for the last several years is intended to understand these tactics that were really developed by the tobacco industry and that now we see widely used by other industries. Several experts have referred to these tactics that collectively are used as ways to manufacture doubt. And we define this as actions that deliberately alter and misrepresent knowable facts. So these aren't areas where there's honest scientific debate, but where there's knowable information that individuals deliberately alter or misrepresent to promote an agenda, often to benefit a broader industry, a specific corporation, or a group of individuals. And it's this last point that's very important, and it's where we separate those who manufacture doubt from those who perpetuate doubt, right? The average person who is sharing a meme on Facebook or tweeting a tweet that is outside of their area of expertise may be doing something that benefits industry, but without the knowledge that they're doing it for that reason. We refer to those as doubt perpetuators. And in fact, the use of social media and the spread of information in much more modern ways has allowed doubt to be perpetuated in lay audiences in ways that it was not in previous generations. One of the things that we have been doing is to look across industries to try to understand what are the various tactics that have been used across different industries. And my colleagues and I selected case studies that are exceptionally well documented, that we can get primary documents from these various industries, from individuals that were involved in these cases. And we wanted to compare them to see where is there consistency in the kinds of tactics that are used by industries to manipulate knowledge and to manufacture doubt. So these are the 5 industries that we have looked at to date, some of which are really large industries like tobacco or the sugar industry, others that are much smaller, so focused on a single chemical, in this case, the production of atrazine, which is a pesticide used to control weeds, and also things that don't just involve a single industry, but multiple organizations, like discussions around climate change. What we did is to evaluate as many documents as we could from those 5 industries, and we identified 28 unique tactics that are used by one or more of these industries to manufacture doubt. And I've listed those tactics here, and I won't read this list to you, but what you can see is that there's a range of tactics that are used, and they're used to target different audiences. In some cases, the point is to try to convince the public that there's nothing to worry about. In other cases, the point is to try to convince the judicial system or regulatory systems. Sometimes it's to try to influence other scientists and experts in the field. And so different tactics are better employed depending on who is the intended audience of that manipulated information. If you go to the next slide, what you're going to see is that of these 28 tactics, several were shared by all 5 of the industries that we examined, which means that these are incredibly effective tactics that are used broadly to try to manipulate public knowledge and to manipulate decision making around around obvious public health threats. Other tactics you can see, and the numbers here are irrelevant. They correspond to a table that I'm happy to share with those of you, but it's published and it's an open access article. Other tactics were unique to specific industries because the tactic was designed to protect some aspect of that industry's behavior. These are the tactics that are widely shared across industries. So I think they're worth giving a little bit of attention to because they're techniques that are quite effective. One is to attack the scientific studies themselves. This is not to say that there is such thing as a perfect study. There is no such thing as a perfect study. Every study has flaws or limitations to it. But when using this tactic, what industries do is they take science and they tear it apart. They emphasize study designs that really would only have a minimal impact on the outcome. And they emphasize flaws in studies that are often some of the best evidence that the polluting industry is causing harm to the public. Another tactic is to gain support from reputable individuals. So they'll look for politicians, members of industry, doctors, scientists, health officials to try to defend the product. In some cases, these are experts who would have a reasonable reputation that's involved in the field. So finding a doctor to talk about an effect on the liver makes sense. Finding a physicist to talk about an effect on the liver doesn't make sense. And yet you can find physicists who will speak outside of their zone of expertise and will use their credentials to support unsupportable cases. There's also examples where data are just actively misrepresented. And there's a bunch of ways that this can be done. Industry can design studies purposefully to fail and then use them to pollute the scientific literature to suggest that there is doubt when no doubt actually exists. There are plenty of ways we all know to cherry pick data as a way to support one viewpoint versus another. And oftentimes when this is done, the cherry picked data also have other conflicts of interest. So there's other reasons to not support using those data. There's also the use of hyperbolic language. We've seen this a lot with climate change. We've seen this a lot with studies of agrochemicals. This use of buzzwords like junk science versus sound science is a really easy way to dismiss entire fields of study. I've seen this done with environmental epidemiology to suggest that an entire field of study should not be trusted. And the public has a very hard time understanding the nuances of various scientific fields, and they can fall victim very easily to these kinds of labels of junk science or sound science. And the last is to use power and proximity to regulatory bodies as a way to influence government action or change laws in ways that are pro-industry. An example of this that we saw in the United States were laws that were meant to protect companies involved in coal mining, to actually be able to legally define medical things like what is black lung, or what is what criteria have to be met to be considered a case with black lung. There are a series of other tactics that have been identified that were used by multiple industries, but not all of them, which suggests that they're highly effective, but maybe not essential tactics. These include where industries actively suppress information that they have access to that would be incriminating, that industries are involved in determining how to measure an outcome or an exposure. Again, the example of black lung would be a great example of this, but also to say with biomonitoring, if a chemical isn't found at a certain concentration, we determine that that concentration is hazardous or not hazardous. It doesn't matter what scientific consensus actually says about that. Industries contribute misleading literature. They take advantage of the fact that non-scientists often lack scientific literacy or are entirely scientifically illiterate. They pose as a defender of health or truth. We already heard about that this morning, that the ability to sort of create front groups that pretend that they have the public's best interest in mind, but really their goal is to manipulate knowledge and to manufacture doubt about the harms that come from chemicals. We see this widely in my field of study, and also the ability to blame other causes. The reason why these tactics work, is that they appeal to logical fallacies that are patterns that the human brain finds comfortable. So the idea that someone is an expert and so we should trust them is a pattern that is effective and that we all fall into. I assume that because someone has a large Twitter following and they have professor as their title, it means that they're going to only speak about things that they have an actual expertise in, but that's a logical fallacy. There's a lot of appealing to emotion that we see. The suggestion that regulations will cause people to lose their jobs, to lose their ability to farm, that we'll lose our ability to feed people. Those are arguments that are not often grounded in any science at all, and are used to appeal to emotion. And so in this way, one of the best things that we can do to combat the use of manufactured doubt is to teach people, including decision makers, because we are all prone to falling victim to logical fallacies. In fact, there are studies that show that scientists are often no better than the average member of public at identifying logical fallacies. Because we're prone to falling for them, we have to find ways to educate people. And this means educating our colleagues as scientists, but also educating decision makers so that everyone at all levels of public health promotion can recognize when doubt is being manufactured and combat it so that we can prevent the harm that that pollution, that climate change, that other very serious public health harm could bring to people can be fought with competing logic. So I'm going to end my comments there, and I would be happy to take any questions if we have time at the end.
Thank you very much, Professor Vandenberg, for this excellent presentation. And it shows how trust, as the word you used just a few minutes ago, is absolutely crucial to this process. And it is true that there would be no right to science without a clear protection of the integrity of the process, of the scientific process. What is interesting, though, is which refers back to the discussion we started with, is that science policy interface, the most famous one, which is the IPCC, has resisted finally, and we can see that today because it still has its credibility and has resisted to the very strong attack it was under in order to manufacture doubts. So it is interesting to see here that this process of going towards science policy interface does help to some extent. And of course, for all of this, we need a lot of transparency in the process to understand, and participation, which is one of the elements which is very clearly indicated in the report of the Special Rapporteur. And talking about participation, it also helps people to understand the environment in which they are, and also to contribute to the advancement of science. We very often forget that there's a number of scientific fields who can only progress thanks to the participation of people who are providing information, doing observation, and so on. So there's a large sector which needs to be very well recognized. And actually in the field of chemicals, and I would like to turn now to Mrs. Sarojeni RENGAM from the Pesticide Action Network in Asia Pacific, and she's the executive director of this organization, who has done a lot of work precisely in what we call citizen science, which is how people in the field who are not labeled as scientists, but do have a knowledge and have a capacity to understand what is around in their own environment. It is a very, very interesting experience of how you can relate to science and how it can help to prevent and protect. Sarojeni RENGAM, the floor is yours, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Yves, and thank you for the invitation for the side event. And Thank you also for the excellent report of the Special Rapporteur on toxics, Marcos Orellana. My topic is citizens science, and we actually have developed what we call a community-based pesticide action monitoring. And these are some of the photos from that monitoring. And the one that I kind of highlighted in the middle is we found this paraquat being sold in this polythene bags. It was about 3 years ago in India. And it's not just in India, it's all over. And this is the kind of documentation that groups on the ground at the community level are documenting and bringing it up for policy changes at the Rotterdam Convention to show that paraquat is a dangerous pesticide and action needs to be taken. Just to mention that the UN human rights experts call highly hazardous pesticides a global human rights concern because of the catastrophic impact on the environment, human health, and society as a whole. And this was in 2017. It was a joint report from the Special Rapporteur on Right to Food and Toxics. So why did we start this process of community monitoring? One of the key things was we were very concerned about the impact both in terms of environment and health of pesticides. There was very little information of the reality of pesticide use in communities and on the ground. There was a big information gap. And so we also thought we need to have the community involved to be empowered to take action based on the kind of documentation of the harm that is caused by pesticides, but also the way that it's being used at the local level. And just wanted to highlight that in 2020, there was a report that came out from that showed there's an estimated 385 million cases of unintentional acute pesticide poisoning every year, and mainly occupational, including 11,000 deaths. And you're talking about 44% of all farmers and farm workers, and mostly from the south. And that's a big concern. And so this CPAM tool was important to make sure that we have the documentation, we have the community engaged in this so that they can take action at the community level, as well as at the policy level. So this is the kind of thing that when we envision how this would work, we talked about, we always discuss with the communities through the partner organizations at the national community level. And it's community empowerment, and it's using the available knowledge and tools to document what's happening on the ground. So increasing the level of scientific and technical competence at all levels. And we train farmers and workers and women to gather that information, working with the CSOs on the ground, of course. So there's a big collaboration between the community, health groups, health workers, NGOs, CSOs, scientists, public health experts, etc. And this documentation becomes very important to assist in organizing and mobilizing farmers at the community level, but reaching out to others who are being affected by these pesticides and feeding that into policy, both in terms of local government, but also at the national level, and through campaigns, policy discussions, as well as to promote alternatives or agroecology, alternatives to hazardous pesticides. And through this documentation, feeding it also at the international level. So it's basically what is CPAM, a systematic method of participatory action documentation on the impact of pesticides. And it's done by farmers and agricultural workers and by the communities with the support of the CSOs, and it's for action. Moving on, these are some of the steps in CPAM. So training of facilitators, use of CPAM, then conduct CPAM, analyze, develop the report together with the community so that we always validate and the information goes back to the community, and then follow up and action, which I mentioned earlier. This was one of the results of CPAM. This is at the regional level, but we have lots of national reports as well. This was done for 2 years. 2,000 farmers and workers were interviewed and became part of the CPAM process. This is some of the findings that we found. So through that monitoring, we were also able to identify some of the highly hazardous pesticides where the community then can take action to start campaigning, demonstrating, public protests, as well as to create awareness at the community and national level. I just want to show how the documentation looks like. This is some of the information. I won't go too deep into this, but what is interesting for us was that 7 out of the 10 interviewed suffered symptoms of pesticide poisoning, and this score is it's actually quite similar to these the monitoring that FAO was doing in the Mekong countries. They also found 7 out of 10 farmers and workers interviewed suffered symptoms of pesticide poisoning. So then what happens at the community level? Some of the successes we have found because of the support from the community, the local CSOs. We were able to work with some of the government officials, and we have bans of pesticides in Vietnam, Malaysia, India, and Sri Lanka. In fact, Sri Lanka got the World Future Council Award because of the tremendous work they have done to reduce the risks of pesticides in Sri Lanka. It was a long struggle and it took years, and I really feel for what Laura was saying, because that's exactly what happened. In all the cases where we were able to bring CPAM documentation with secondary data, secondary scientific studies to show that this particular pesticide is a problem. For example, paraquat, it took so many years to get it banned in Malaysia, for example. And then the CPAM documentation helped communities, as I mentioned, to identify the problems and the pesticides and to take action. What is for us very important was the community gets organized, because they see what's happening and they say, this should not be affecting us and our families, and we should do, let's work together, let's organize ourselves and then take action. One of the other key elements of this was also that while they are doing these campaigns, they also say, what are the alternatives? How can we get out of this cycle of poison? And that's when they start to talk about, explore other farmers in terms of agroecology or organic farming, and practice that. So, and then awareness building, I think, is for us another critical element. This is a 5-year-old son of an activist who said, I love organic food. And he was 5 and we took a photo of what he felt, very, that he wants organic food. I actually wanted to share 2 case studies. One is where in Sri Lanka, we started to work with a group of women, and they started CPAM monitoring, and then they found, when the farmers were getting sick and suffering the adverse effects, and they said, let's organize, let's mobilize women farmers to confront these pesticides. They identified paraquat, they had a big campaign. Sri Lanka finally banned it. This was, a decade ago, and they started to strengthen their perspective and expose the corporate control of the trade of these chemicals. They also start to organize themselves as Vikalpani as a national federation. And after 3 decades, they have succeeded in a big way. There are lots of women and farmers who are women farmers and workers who are practicing agroecology. You have Sri Lanka, as I mentioned, very progressive in terms of bans of pesticides compared with other countries in Asia. And they've continued to advance their struggle for land for women farmers. So it went beyond pesticide issue to also take on issues on the ground that were so important for women farmers. Then another case study I wanted to also share is that this was more recent, and this happened in Yavatmal in India. In 2017, over 80 farmers were poisoned and died in Yavatmal. In fact, when the government investigation did the investigation, they found 272 farmers have died due to pesticide poisoning in 4 years in that area. When we, together with Pan India, Tunnel, and Public Eye, and another German group, we did the documentation, and we found that polo or diphenthioron was used, and some farmers linked it to their poisoning. And so now the documentation showed was compiled and brought to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, through their complaint mechanism, and 51 victims have been identified suffering ill effects of polo. And this is now being in the complaint kind of process right now. Furthermore, we had an additional 3 victims using polo who said that they were incapacitated and they have filed legal suits. One passed away, who died, so his wife is part of this suit, legal suit. And Pan India has demanded also Syngenta to stop selling brands like Polo in India, because farmers do not have any access to PPE, and it's impossible in a climate like India. And of course, Polo is banned in Switzerland, where the company is based. But what's also for us very important is that the community has organized itself. It's gone to do national policy advocacy campaigning, and they are called the Maharashtra Association of Pesticide Poison Persons, MAP. And so that is, a way that they can continue the struggle even when, some of the cases don't get, because it will take a long time for the legal case, etc. So, so in conclusion, I just wanted to emphasize that citizen science, or CPAM, is really for us a way to meet the needs of communities and contribute to the relevance of science. So it adds to the level of scientific knowledge, but as well as for us a tool that we could use for campaign and advocacy. It provides the underpinning and supports the right to science at the community level. So that's why we find this document and the report of the Special Rapporteur very important. And it helps to strengthen community organizing around impacts of pesticides and chemicals on health and the environment. And you can see that this is a photo from Vietnam, where they're taking action. They're saying these are the impacts of pesticides, and we need to do something about this. And it also empowers farmers to make the shift from pesticides dependency to agroecology. And we know thousands of farmers in Asia, and elsewhere are showing agroecology works and is economically feasible. So I'll end here. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you to you, Sarojeni, RENGAM. I mean, this has been a really very interesting presentation, and it shows clearly the picture of how much this is a human rights issue. And also, you've shown very well how much citizen science not only helps to improve knowledge, which is what we need in the field, but also helps to develop and implement norms and policies, and they become a very important actors of the norms we are talking about right now. But actually talking about norms and policies, this is also the field of our next speaker, Mrs. Monica Gail-Magdavet, who is the Chief Chemical and Health Branch in UNEP, right at the heart of the issue we are talking about today, and also very much involved in the process that have been mentioned right at the very beginning. So Monica, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. And distinguished guests, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to give this presentation. And Yves, I think you're going to do the honors there. Thank you very much. I just would like to take these last few minutes of the webinar and perhaps recap and reiterate and reinforce some of the things that have already been said and mentioned about the need for a science policy interface, but from UNEP's perspective. So what I'd like to do is bring to your attention that the work that UNEP did on the science policy interface recommendations was a mandate from the United Nations Environment Assembly. So the member states asked UNEP to do this. And this builds on the recommendations that came out of the Global Chemicals Outlook 2 to strengthen the science policy interface, because some of you may recall that the Global Chemicals Outlook 2nd edition found that progress had been made, but much more needs to be done. So UNEP was called upon to come up with some perhaps options on a science policy interface, and there's the language that was used to give us, I suppose, our marching orders. So just to recap what was in that report, the report reviewed a variety of existing science policy interface platforms and models and discusses some of the lessons learned from these. In terms of looking at some of the impacts and the outputs of a strengthened science policy platform, how such platforms can inform different stages of the policymaking process, and some of the key characteristics of science policy interfaces, noting that they are rarely linear and are more accurately represented as several iterative phases that feed into and shape one another. And so what we need to keep in mind, and I think this was really borne out in some of the previous presentations, and the need for unbiased and sort of scientific fact presentation, is that a science policy interface seeks to facilitate and inform discussions on how to strengthen the science policy dialogue for, in this case in particular, chemicals and waste management, and thus support and promote science-based local, national, regional, and global action on the sound management of chemicals and waste. And we've seen some really amazing and very powerful examples from the local level also to the global action level. Science policy interfaces also aim to provide elements for bringing agendas together and how science policy platforms need to interact with and inform each other. And so we did hear of some of the examples of the IPCC, for example, and the IPBES for biodiversity and ecosystem services. Very key to looking at a science policy interface is the ability to support national agencies and other groups with, as was rightly pointed out by Marcus, awareness raising activities, also building capacity, and also access and development information to prepare policy through tools and other methodologies, and also the ability to implement actions related to the sound management of chemicals and waste. So there are a lot of really good reasons why we should be moving in this direction. I just want to acknowledge in this particular slide the very generous both financial and moral support from the government of Switzerland, but also the University of Massachusetts. And I suppose in some ways the father of a lot of the science policy interfaces, Sir Bob Watson, and the real support that was given by John Roberts. This was also done in consultation with the Inter-Organization Program for the Sound Management of Chemicals, or the IOMC, and also the Multilateral Environmental Agreements and their secretariats. So as has been mentioned in the past, some of the key sort of characteristics of science policy platforms are sort of articulated on this particular slide here, and they need to be considered together. I think we have already heard the need for science policy interfaces to be able to engage in horizon scanning, looking into the future, identify emerging issues of concern, monitor the trends that are happening, identify, assess, and communicate environmental and human health issues associated with, in this case, again, chemicals and waste, evaluate and refine response options, practices, policies, and technologies, and potentially stimulate the negotiation and enactment of new policy approaches. And I think, as we have found out from our previous speakers, you can really only gain a lot of success and be authoritative when you're credible, relevant, legitimate, and transparent. And so these are the hallmarks of science policy interfaces that really do need to be captured. What I'd like to do is just conclude by the findings in this report really did look at the landscape of existing science policy platforms. And it did conclude that what is currently out there is not comprehensive enough to address the multiple facets of the sound management of chemicals and waste. There's fragmentation, isolated approaches, and perhaps even siloed approaches that are not overall and overarching and comprehensive, but sometimes even in an ad hoc manner. So the current models do not really allow for informed decision-making or actions at the national or international level in a comprehensive manner. And I think akin to the IPCC for climate change and the IPBES for biodiversity and ecosystem services, the call for something of an equal footing for the sound management of chemicals and waste really is timeous. And I'm going to end there and perhaps leave just a few minutes for questions. It's been a very rich and very full session. And I hope this has helped to sort of wrap up some of the things that has been said. And as always, UNEP stands ready to support its member states and stakeholders in the directions that we want to take the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you, Monica. Indeed, it's been an excellent wrap-up, and we are all looking forward to the decision that we'll be taking at the United Nations Environmental Assembly at the beginning of next year, and we'll probably precisely aiming at overcoming the silos and the challenge that we have, and for which this report is a really very important contribution. As you said, it has been a very, very rich event and very rich presentation. This brings us very close to the end. Thanks to the Geneva Environment Network team, the questions have been transmitted to the Special Rapporteur. So I will now give the floor to Marcus Orellana for answering these elements and a final word of conclusions. As it has been said in the chat, those who still have questions can quickly put them there, so there will be some answers sent to them after this event. So, Professor Orellana, may I turn to you for an answer to some of these questions and a final word of conclusion?
Thank you, Yves. Considering that there are only a couple minutes left, I will undertake to answer any questions by email to any of the participants, and only at this time thank my fellow panelists for their insightful presentations. The report on the right to science in the toxics context, it provides analysis, a diagnosis, it elaborates on what are the tools that are offered by the right to science to overcome the toxification of the planet that we're facing. It gets into questions of normative content, it analyzes some of the tactics used with impunity. And this is a point that I want to stress, because in order for the report to be meaningful, it has diagnosis, but it needs to be translated into actual solutions. The report has several recommendations that I hope are viable and measurable and can be implemented. Much of it comes down to meaningful public participation, access to information, but also, back to the issue of impunity, actual sanctions, actual measures adopted by states to combat misinformation. There are sanctions for lying in the securities market, in the free competition. There's fraud, but what about lying when it comes to the formation of regulation in the toxics and waste field. There's much to be done there. So with that, all antennas tuned to the next 5.2 session of the UN Environment Assembly, where we may see good progress on a global science policy interface platform as discussed in the panel. I invite you to use the report, you all in the audience. I thank you very much for your attention, and I thank also all the co-conveners. Thank you, Yves, back to you.
Well, thank you to you, Professor Orellana. My turn to really thank all of the panelists for the very, very rich and very useful presentation that has been given. Thank you to you also for your report, and I wish everybody all the best in the continuation of all your activities. Thank you very much for having been with us.
Just bringing to your attention the upcoming events tomorrow. We are back with the Special Rapporteur for a side event on plastics and human rights, and we hope to see you all there.